So the scripture lesson today is from Matthew, and my Bible calls it the Great Commandments. There's two things that we're going to talk about here today. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So I titled this message Community, but it's really about our neighbors. And the question is, who do we think our neighbors are? So where Benita and I live on Scott Drive in Yorktown, the one neighbor on the left side of us, Dave's lived there about 5 years, and I knew him from banking before he moved there. Janet and Noah live on the other side, and they've lived there probably 20 years. So, well, he turned 19 this year, and I remember when he was born. We went to his graduation open house last week, and there was a picture of him at about 1, and he didn't remember this, but anytime they would ask me to watch him, he would cry the whole time. It was a good time for me. And he said, "Well, why did I cry?" And his mom went, "We never knew. It just ended when you were like 2. Just happened." And across the street, Bob and Carolyn live. And we've lived there 34 years, but Bob and Carolyn have lived there longer. And then Steve lives on the other side of this, across the street next to Bob and Carolyn. And he's lived there about 14 years, maybe 12 years. But he's a teacher, but he has taught in Spain and Prague, Czechoslovakia the last 12 years. So the only time we see him is when he comes home in the summer and when he comes home at Christmas time. But he's home now, and he's going to be home for 2 years. And so those are our immediate neighbors. So what I put up here was there's easy neighbors and hard neighbors. And so Carolyn had a brain aneurysm probably more than 5 years ago. So a lot of times when we make food, we just make extra and we take it across the street to Bob. And I would say that's easy because no matter what I grill or Benita makes, Bob is good for taking it. And we just take it in disposable pans and then we're done. And it doesn't matter whether we cook it before or after they eat because we always do it in such a way that they can heat it up. And so I think that's easy. It's easy to help Bob and Carolyn. We've known them forever. There's no threat. I mean, we don't have like a particular day we're going to do something. If I do hamburgers on the grill, I just throw a couple extra on. Benita told me when I told her what the sermon was about, she goes, "Well, it's easier for you than me because I'm the one making most of the food." But she'll just make extra. So if we're making potato salad, she'll make extra potato salad. And so I call that kind of easy. And if we do something for Steve and Dave the other day, I was mowing my grass and I heard this really funny noise. And I look up there and Dave, who has a bad knee and is in his mid-70s anyway, is on a ladder cleaning out his gutter. I didn't think that was probably the best thing for him to be doing. So I stopped my mowing, I went over and got on the ladder and finished. Dave's wife passed away several years ago and has a lady friend, and she was there. And I said, "Well, what are you here for, moral support?" She said, "Well, in theory, if he fell off the ladder, I was going to catch him." And I said, "Well, I would have told you it would have been more like, olé, because you would just have to let him go." So I cleaned the gutters, and maybe it's not the best idea in the world for me to be on the ladder doing that either, but we got the gutters cleaned. Nobody fell off. Nobody hurt themselves. Well, I think that's easy neighbors. It's easy to help them. We know them. We take care of them. Well, then I think we have hard neighbors. Now, I don't have any now, but we had a lady that lived in the house where Dave lived. She was hard. Kids were sort of not very well behaved from our point of view. She didn't keep the property up as nice. There's always stuff going on at the house. When she left, not really disappointed, but when she left, she gave it back to the bank. So the grass got way tall. I mowed it a couple times. When the neighbors mowed it a couple times before we could finally get somebody to do something. And the house, you know the house is empty when you drive down the street and you go, "That's the worst house." That was the worst house, but now it's next to us. So she was a hard neighbor, and it was hard to get to know her and be around her. But also, in the easy part, so if anybody here gives blood, give, they're running short for some reason. I think giving blood's easy. It's not like your immediate neighbor, but you're helping somebody, but you don't do anything. I make an appointment, I lay there for an hour, I'm done. I've never passed out. If I ever did, I probably wouldn't tell you because none of my girls have. And until one of them pass out, I can't say anything about passing out while I'm giving blood. So that to me is easy. I don't really know who I'm helping. I just know I'm helping somebody. And one of the things that I didn't know until the last several years is how much blood cancer patients need. I had a friend who had cancer and she'd get better and had cancer and get better and have cancer and get better. And they did a blood drive in the Yorktown area for 3 people, and she was one of them. And she told me that 1 month, and when she would get ill, she would just disappear. You just wouldn't hear from her. She said 1 month she had to have 8 pints of blood. And I never knew that took that kind of blood donations because of what the cancer was doing to her. And so I think that's easy. That's an easy donation because you don't really have to see the person. You just do something and they get it. Well, mostly what I want to talk about today are the people that are hard. So A Better Way is the domestic violence shelter for this part of Indiana. And I was lucky enough to serve on the board for about 8 years, and then they fired me because there's a term limit. But what I want to do is talk about what they do, and my goal is so that you know what they do, so that when you have a neighbor or friend that needs help, you know a way to direct them. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is hard because you have to get involved, you have to get into somebody's life a little bit, and it's not easy. It's not easy to do that stuff. So what A Better Way does, it's a domestic violence shelter for this part of Indiana. It also does sexual assault. So if a person is assaulted, they can choose to go to A Better Way without going to the police or the hospital first. Now, A Better Way will try to direct them there, but a lot of sexual assaults aren't reported. And so that stigma of what happens to the person is with them until they get help. Another thing A Better Way does is if the person gets there, and a lot of times they don't have transportation, they'll make arrangements for them to get medical help, legal help, and then they provide support groups. And you can only be in the shelter 60 days, and then you have to do something different. That's the way they're funded. It's just the way it is. And so the support groups go on afterwards to assist people as they get through whatever their issues were. Another thing they do is they offer a crisis suicide hotline. I don't know if it's because people are more isolated now because of the virus, but suicides are up nationally pretty substantially. One of the things that made me do this was the first Sunday I was here, somebody in the back, there was a suicide in Selma. They brought that up, and they were talking about the people that found them, how it distressed them so. And a lot of times I don't think people think about that. They only think about the person that harmed themselves. But they cover 34 counties in Indiana. Starting on August 1st, when I met with Teresa a couple weeks ago, who's the CEO or director, whatever her title is, they're going to start something new where you can text in for a suicide hotline. And I said, well, won't that be hard because you won't have context? She said, well, that's a problem with it. She said, but a lot of times people are in a place that they can't really call and get help because the person would hear them asking for help. But they wouldn't think anything about them texting somebody because so many people text all the time. So they are hoping that it gives people another chance. The telecare services, when my father was not too long before he passed away, he wasn't taking care of himself very well, and I wasn't really having much luck getting him to do anything. But one of the things I did was I used LifeStream's Meals on Wheels program to check on him. And so they did two things. They brought him a meal that he either would eat or not eat, but at least I knew he had a chance to eat a good meal. And the other thing, every day, they actually would make sure he was in the house. And so I would call him every evening to check on him, but I worked out of town. So it was a way for me to kind of have him checked on at least Monday through Friday to make sure everything was okay with him. He had a stroke, which is eventually what caused him to pass away, and the driver found him sometime between, I talked to him like at 8 o'clock the night before to noon when the driver came. They found that he'd had a stroke. But a couple of times they would call me and say, hey, he's not home, but he's supposed to be. And I said, well, he told me I had a doctor's appointment. Or I would say, I have no idea where he is. He told me he'd be home too. But it was a way for us to have him checked on. That's kind of what Telecare Services is. What they do is if you have someone, they'll just call and make sure they're okay. And if they're not, they have some contact numbers so they can get in touch with someone else to help them. A couple other things that A Better Way does, they have Passageway, which is a transitional housing. I don't know if you guys are aware of this or not, but if you have someone that's in an abusive situation, there's like an 80 to 90% chance that they'll go back to the abuser. A lot of that's because they are economically don't have the ability. They may not have a place to stay. They may not have the education to go out and get a job. So what Passageway does is it gives them up to 2 years. It's lower rent based on their income. And it's an apartment, so you can have a whole family together. And so it gives them a chance to go back to school and finish their education, or maybe get a specific training so they're not forced to go back to where the violence was taking place before. Rapid rehousing is sort of an offshoot of that. 2 years ago, as I was leaving A Better Way, so this is why you never borrow money from the federal government. They borrowed money to build Passageway. It was a 10-unit apartment, some 2, some 3 bedrooms. In like 3 more years, that money is forgiven as long as they keep using it for that. Well, the way the agency paid for that mostly was they got a grant from HUD. So HUD comes back and says, you know what, we don't think transitional housing works. We're not going to support it anymore. So we said, okay, what about the grant? Yeah, you need to keep it the same kind of housing numbers in there, or you're going to have to pay the whole $400,000 back. Thank you for your assistance, because it just wasn't helpful. Well, this rapid rehousing kind of came out of that, and so it's a place for people to go live, but it's usually single-family homes. So it's not owned by the agency. Somebody owns a home, and they just make it eligible for rapid rehousing. So if I came in and said, hey, having problems, my spouse is battering me, and it's not always women. They have men at the shelter, and my spouse is battering me, and I'm going to get the kids, but we don't have any place to go. Well, rapid rehousing, and it acts as another place instead of the shelter. So instead of going into a shelter, you would go into the home. So that kind of gives you a broad overview of what A Better Way does. Now, one of the things I asked Teresa, I said, how did this virus affect what you guys do? Because my guess is when people are more together, people are lost jobs, a lot of them, that doesn't lead to better times at home. It makes more stress, and so you would have more issues. And although we had all these things that were essential, apparently the governor of Indiana decided liquor stores were essential. So people being able to still go out and get liquor and be all together at the same time, those things do not make for a peaceful family life. She said during the virus, their amount of people in the shelter went down. She said that was a pretty national trend. People were more afraid of coming into the shelter and becoming sick than staying at home and dealing with whatever issues they had there. So to give you an idea, it used to be a secret where the shelter is. It's right across from the YWCA at the old funeral home. Passageway is just right behind it as an apartment building. And so it's built in sort of like, there's like 8 kind of family units there. So the whole family can stay, but they share a kitchen, they share some common areas. So it was hard for the agency to keep people separate. One of the things they did is they had a couple empty apartments in Passageway, so they kind of used Passageway as a quarantine area, so they keep people there a couple weeks to make sure they didn't have the virus before they brought them into the shelter. I said, well, what about going forward? She said, well, since it kind of opened up, we've filled right back up. She said, now that people aren't afraid of the virus as much as they're afraid of whatever was going in their home, it's switched, and now we're pretty full. And I said, so what nationally are you seeing? She said, about the same thing, but that same thing's happened nationally. So, The unemployment rate's still pretty high. It's going to cause stress in families, the families that a lot of times already have stress or problems. So you're going to see more issues. And I would be surprised with us if we haven't seen something. Sorry, couldn't remember what else I was going to say. So what's our obligation in this? Well, I've got some examples, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. And since I don't know you guys that well, I usually use me as the example because I know what I either did or didn't do when I should have done or not done something, as the case may be. So one day, when I worked at Old National, I worked downtown. You could see some goofy stuff downtown Muncie sometimes. So one night I was walking out of the bank. I must have been a little late because there wasn't anybody around, and I don't remember any cars, but I could hear two people arguing pretty loudly. And they were coming out of the health department, which is just right around the corner. So I walked around the corner, but I had taken my phone out. And there was a guy, he was giving this lady way too much stuff. And I said, "Hey, is there a problem here?" And she turned and she goes, "Nope, everything's okay." And I said, "Are you sure?" She goes, "Nope, it's settled, we're okay now." So they walked off together, but the arguing stopped, at least for there. So one of those obligations is sometimes you got to get involved. And the world in which we live in now, you are taking a risk. It is not without risk. And so you'll have to decide on an individual basis whether that's when you're supposed to get involved or not. And maybe you're just supposed to call the police and say, "Hey, I think there's a problem here." And in downtown Muncie, where that was, within a couple of minutes, there would have been a policeman there because they were driving around all the time. Now, I've heard people argue downtown before, and there were a lot of people around, and I didn't get involved because it did seem like I need to be the person involved. I don't know what the difference was when I got involved and when I didn't get involved. It just was something I felt that I was supposed to do or not do. So when we talk about neighbors, and we're responsible for all our neighbors, that's one of the things that you have to decide how you're going to get involved or if you're going to walk away. And I can't tell you when you're supposed to get involved and when you're supposed to walk away because I'm not there. And it's something that God will either lead you to do or not to do, and whatever you choose is what you chose. I can't just say this is the way you should do it every time because I don't know. I don't know the situation. I gave this message at Honey Creek a couple years ago, and the reason I did that was there was a family just outside of Middletown where the husband murdered the wife and a child after something went on in the house. What I would tell you is it is unlikely, very unlikely, that was the first time that happened in that house. It just doesn't work that way. Might have, but usually the violence is increasing over time. So either nobody knew about it, and the spouse was like a school psychologist or something. You would have thought she would have shared, but nobody said she ever did. Violence in the family is not economic. It's not social, because it's not age. It can be all over the place. There was a lady in the shelter one time when I was there for a meeting, and I asked who she was, and she said she is a victim of domestic violence. And I said, she seems older to me. And she said she's in her 80s. She and her husband have been married for like 60 years. It's not about age. She said they're pretty well off. It's not about money. It's just that was the relationship in their home. And so periodically she would come to the shelter, but at the end of the day she would always go back. When I was talking about those support groups, it's to let, whether it's a man or woman, know there are other choices in their life, and they don't just have to go back to the situation they were in. But for us, when we have family or friends or somebody that we know there clearly is a problem, are we going to get involved? So I'm going to pick on Bonnie for a minute. So if I see Bonnie one day and she seems distressed, and I said, "Bonnie, are you okay? What are you going to tell me?"
Depends on the circumstances.
Most of the time, what do people say though?
No, I'm okay.
Fine, I'm okay. Right, because that's what we do. How are you today? Sicker than a dog? You're thinking all this. Sicker than a dog, this has happened. Hey, everything's fine. It's what we do. But I can look at Bonnie and go, there's more going on here. Am I willing to say, Bonnie, are you sure you just seem distressed to me today? Because now that's harder. It was easier to ask her how everything was if I was pretty sure she was going to say everything was okay. But when I ask her the second time, now I'm encouraging her to be truthful. And if she goes, well, something's happening. We have to take a step out to do that because the first one was easy, the second one's harder. And if she tells something that we need to act on, how do we do that? What do we do? How involved are we going to be? And so you guys will all make your own decisions when that time comes. Now the other part, the reason why I told you I did this at Honey Creek, the reason I'm doing this here, and I already talked about the first Sunday I was here, there was a suicide that someone brought up, and we had prayer for that. So you guys know I've been here as a child. My best friend ended his life when we were coming here, as he was a senior and I was about a year and a half older than him. And when that came up, I just immediately thought of that again because it wasn't very far from here. He lived in Muncie, but he ended his life not very far from here, probably a half mile. And I thought, well, you know what? Maybe that's God's way of saying I'm supposed to talk about this. And so it's been 40-some years since that happened, but every once in a while it just pops back in my mind. And what bothers me is I saw him a week or so before, and there was something wrong. Even as a 19-year-old, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't say anything to him. And so when that happened, I always felt like that was my fault, that I didn't do anything. I just thought, it'll be okay. And it turned out not to be okay. So one of the things we're going to do in the bulletin is A Better Way has a line for the shelter for help, a line for suicide prevention, and then what they call crisis, which can be like anything. But we're going to put those numbers in the bulletin. And even if you don't know how to get involved, if you have someone that you know needs one of those services, at least it gives us the ability to hand them the bulletin and say, hey, I don't know how to help you, but clearly something's going on in your life, and these numbers here, call whichever one you think applies to you because they can help you. Now, A Better Way did not exist when my friend ended his life. It's not that old. There might have been somebody somewhere around that did stuff like that, but it wasn't somebody that I knew. It wasn't someone I was familiar with. I want us to be aware of that so that we know that we have options. So although we may not personally be able to do something about it, we can at least try to help them get someplace where they can get the help they need. So, you look in the world we live in now, and you can think about all the ways that people mistreat each other and are not civil to each other. They're just not. There's a lot. You can't hardly have a conversation with anybody with somebody getting all bent out of shape. Or as I like to say, they get their panties in a bunch. They just get all bent out of shape. Well, this neighbor, if we're going to treat everybody like our neighbor, then we have to figure out a way to get around those things, to help people when they need help, even if they don't know they need help. And so I just think this is one way to do that. We may not always be able to help them. It may not be something that we can do personally, but I think the more agencies, the more people that we know, it gives us a chance to help people that maybe we couldn't before. And so, I talk about homework. This is long-term homework here. A, you have to decide if you're willing to do it, and B, you have to acknowledge that you see it. So much of whether it's the abuse or the violence, it just goes unreported. Or people make excuses for why it happens. But it happens. What I always say is read the second page of the Muncie Star. That's where it all is. And so the goal for A Better Way is that we don't need the agency anymore. That's the goal. Because that would mean that people are getting along and you don't have those kind of relationships that create those issues. We're not there yet, but we hope to be someday. And I don't know that that can happen through our own works, but through God, everything is possible. Let us pray. Father, we're so grateful that you brought us together today. Let us take your love and your grace out into your world and share it with all those that we come in contact with. In your beautiful name, we are so joyful, so grateful for all you do each and every day. Amen.